Hello, greetings. I'm Steve Rhoads, the author of The Economist's View of the World and The Quest for Well-Being. I'm a retired professor of political science at the University of Virginia, but in graduate school, I studied over 20 hours of graduate level economics. So I wrote a book about economics, and a lot of real economists have praised it. I'm delighted about that. Well, first of all, I try to make it very reader friendly. It's aimed not just at students, but at ordinary intelligent readers who want to know about economics and don't know much about it. How do I make it more readable? No graphs, no equations, just good English. Lots of examples and anecdotes. I also think it helps that it was used actually 20 years after publication in some classes. And how is this possible, I wonder, because it's got a lot of examples and every one of the examples is at least 20 years old. And I think the only way to explain it is it doesn't focus as much on particular issues as it does on concepts, opportunity costs, marginalism, markets. And they're pretty abstract, but I make them less abstract by these anecdotes and by the examples. So it becomes dated less quickly. And third, I tried very hard to make it not ideological. In the first edition, there were liberals who supported it strongly and conservatives supported it strongly. This edition, I'm delighted that Alan Blinder, who's a distinguished Princeton professor who's been active in Democratic administrations, has been strongly supportive. And just as supportive has been Greg Mankiw, who's a Harvard professor, distinguished Harvard professor. He's been strongly active in Republican administrations. Well, most important, I think, is the growth of populism. There's a right-wing populism, and there's a left-wing populism. And there's a lot of emotion behind both of them. And economists tend to not want policy and politics to be all about emotion. They want a lot of arguments based on facts and data and historical results here and elsewhere. And mainstream economists don't like populism much, and therefore they're nice that we get their point of view on board along with the populist point of view. And some of the populists on the left have begun to talk about socialism being superior to capitalism or free markets. You won't find enough support about that among mainstream economists. In fact, let me just briefly mention, there's Paul Krugman at New York Times, big supporter of markets in his textbook. And there's Paul Stiglitz, he's at Columbia. It's not Paul, it's Joseph Stiglitz. And he actually he agrees with Bernie Sanders about a lot. He says this economy is not stable, it's not efficient, it's not fair. You might think, well, he's probably a socialist, but he's not. He says, look, I'm not a socialist. I'm a compassionate capitalist. I'm a free market guy because I realize that every economy in the world uses markets, and every economy in the world that's successful uses private enterprise. So if you think that only people talk about markets are conservative, I'm going to try to disabuse you of that today and even more completely in my book. All right, well, another reason we need a new edition, besides the old examples and so on, is that it used to be said 35 years ago, look, a rising tide rises all boats. In other words, the argument was, if there's more economic growth, that's good for every quintile of income. So we really don't want to do anything that interferes with economic growth. Now, of course, that isn't a common position. People talk a lot about redistribution, how the top 1% have far more than they should be getting from economic growth. Those below median incomes are getting far less than they should be getting. So I have to get into redistribution in a major way with a big, long chapter. Well, I'm going to begin with diamonds and water. This even puzzled Adam Smith because marginalism didn't come into its heyday until the 19th century. And he said, why is it? Look, diamonds aren't that important to life. Water's terribly important. But you can get a bucket of water for almost nothing, and a bucket of diamonds, that'd set you up for life if you sold them. How is it possible that water is less expensive than diamonds? And he just left it as a puzzle. Well, the marginalists came along and they said, I think we figured it out, and they really did figure it out. Prices depend on what we would pay for an additional unit of something. What would we pay for an additional bucket of water? What would we pay for an additional bucket of diamonds? Very different than what we would pay for the average amount. So this is what economists say almost all decisions are made at the margin. And you have to keep your eye on government administrators because they'll come to the meeting of the budget people and they'll say, look, all our programs, we looked at every single one, they all have benefits exceeding the cost. Well, if the administrators or the budgeteers are smart, they'll say, yeah, that's true. I don't doubt it for most of your programs at the average, but what about additional spending? Are they going to have the benefits exceed the costs? Now, one new program on a lot of highways, you probably run into it, is rumble strips. You know, you're driving along, and if you start to coast toward the side of the road in a dangerous position, these rumble strips come into play. Boom, 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 and you can't sleep for very long. If you begin to sleep, the rumble strips will wake you up. Great idea. I'm sure they save a lot of lives. I'm sure they prevent a lot of accidents. But at some point, I think we still want to make them an important part of highway programs, but at some point you can imagine if we get them in all the interstates and we get them in most of the main other roads, and we're beginning to think about, do we want them in country roads that don't have almost no traffic and therefore almost no accidents? And we might be saying, well, I don't know whether we want more rumble strips. They're pretty expensive for each mile of rumble strips. Country roads are very long. It may be we ought to put our money somewhere else at this stage. A good budgeteer will ask that kind of question because he'll be interested in benefits and costs at the margin. Now, another place this comes up is you'll see cities will want to do a survey of the public. Let's find out what the public thinks what public thinks we should spend more money. Should it be on safety, for example? Should it be on transportation? Should it be on recreation? Should it be on education? And the public will come back and inevitably they'll say safety first. And then who knows what comes second? Maybe education. My guess is recreation would be down fifth or sixth. Now, suppose a person in the administration took that seriously. He said, well, look, the people have set their priorities and budget and the safety's first. And, you know, Little League baseball can be pretty dangerous. Every other year or so, somebody's killed by a batted ball. Lots of concussions from batted balls. There are lots of cases where a pitcher pitches, it hits the batter in the chest and the batter's heart stops. Worst of all, the most dangerous youth sport for eyes is baseball, Little League baseball. And he may come in and he say, I don't think we should support on public lands Little League baseball anymore. The public say they want safety first. Now, what do you think would happen? My guess is the public would be outraged. They would say, I never said that. We said, yes, you did. You said safety was first. That doesn't mean we want nothing for recreation. Millions of people play Little League baseball. They get a lot of pleasure out of it. I can't worry about an accident that happens once in a blue moon. You just misinterpreted what I want. An economist says that's because we asked the question wrong. We shouldn't be asking, do you like safety more than recreation? We should be giving guidance to the public. If we had another $10,000 to spend on safety, here's how we would spend it. If we had another $10,000 on recreation, here's how we would spend it. And this is what the results might be. You see, we give them the marginal question, they'll give you good answers. They won't give you good answers if you just ask them. Essentially, you're asking them, what are the average benefits of safety programs? That's not going to be relevant to what we want to talk about. Well, they are, first of all. I've already indicated that Stiglitz and Krugman, who are well to the left of most economists, both good economists, both Nobel laureates, are big market men. but they want to adjust markets, of course, more than the conservatives do. But I think most economists say, look around the world. Communism hated the idea of having to depend on capitalism to have growth. They began by saying we're going to have central planning. Chairman Mao had it. He had a terrible economy. He even admitted as much. At one point he said, well, I worried about having lots of steel, but I didn't worry enough about the fact that steel doesn't travel by itself. We didn't have enough transportation. So there are all these bottlenecks with central planning. Now, I could give you examples of where things have been done, say in cafeterias and in trash collection, and where it shows the private sector contracting out gives you the same results for less cost. But it'd be more interesting, I think, to look at the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they had a very interesting case study that came up. And here's why. The House of Representatives contracted out their cafeterias. And they did great. Food was good. The cost was low, so low that every year they gave an extra bonus to the House of Representatives. Now, what about in the Senate? In the Senate, the food was terrible. There were cost overruns. People in the Senate, all the employees, not all of them, but a lot of employees, it's a long trek from the cafeteria in the Senate to the cafeteria in the House, but they would make it. They wanted to have good food at a reasonable price. The Senate had lousy food at an expensive price. They lost money every year. The only way they continued to have a cafeteria in the Senate was having a contribution from taxpayers every year. It had gone up to $1 million. Next year is projected to keep it alive, it'd have to take $2 million. So a committee was formed, all Democrats, because the Democrats controlled the Senate at the time. What should we do about this? Dianne Feinstein was the chair, and she and the rest of the committee members looked into it. And she said, I'm afraid we have to contract out our cafeterias. And the Democrats were often upset with private sector who contracted out and people lost their jobs. She said, well, we oppose that in the private sector. I don't want to do that. And Feinstein said, what do you want to do? You want to pay $2 million subsidy from the public? Are you going to defend that if one of them learns about it? So they argued and so on. People weren't happy, but they agreed in the committee that they would have to contract out. Then it took it to the Senate. I mean, the Senate's Democrats as a whole. Big uproar, boos, whistles, catcalls. But at the final analysis, they decided to contract out their cafeteria because it seemed that you got better food at less cost, and we wouldn't have to have subsidies anymore. Now think about markets and more generally and how they work and how an administrative system would work. Suppose we have a central planner, the brightest people we can get. Say, plan our economy, and you're in charge of who gets the cement and who gets the steel. And I want you to be in charge also in who gets you'll have a little extra time, and who gets the sawdust. I think the guy's going to look at you and say, sawdust? There's no market for sawdust. I didn't know there was one until I started studying this a couple of years ago, but there is a market for sawdust. And sawdust, of course, comes when people cut lumber. And it turned out that, here's what happened. An economist went to Vermont in the summer, and his milk was much more expensive. And he asked a dairy farmer, how come the milk prices are up so much? He said, all my inputs are up. For example, sawdust is double what it was last year. And the economist said, sawdust? You're a dairy farmer, why do you need sawdust? He said, I use it all the time. The cows give more milk if they're comfortable when they lie down, and they love to lie down on sawdust. Well, he never knew that. So the market for sawdust, well, suppose the administrator gets word about this and says, all right, look, we're going to hold harmless dairy farmers sawdust producers, if they sell next year to cafeterias, school cafeterias, the same amount of sawdust as they did this year. Because we don't want little kids. We get a lot of complaints from parents. They want low-fat milk in the cafeteria, and they say it's too expensive. All right, so then you give a little more extra sawdust, more than the market would give them, to the dairy farmers. Well, you get complaints then from the homeless. They say, look, that's going to mean less. We're building homes for the homeless. We're getting a lot of contributions, not all public money. And we're not going to be able to build as many homes if we can't get sawdust. And you may say, why? Well, sawdust is important in particle boards. And particle boards are important in construction of low-income housing. They're a lot cheaper than lumber. If we can't get our particle boards, our expenses are going to go up, and we're not going to be able to build as many houses. You know, the administrator may say, oh, well, I didn't know that. Okay, we'll try to get you the same amount of particle boards. Well, it's not finished. Sawdust is used in mulch. All the people who have vegetable gardens, they're going to say, why can't I get my mulch? Because it doubled for the dairy farmers, probably doubled at least now that we've given priority to the dairy farmer, to the homeless. Why is it so expensive? Well, we kind of gave a preference to the dairy farmer and the homeless people. Well, why? I need my mulch. And you keep looking, and it turns out sawdust is used in charcoal briquettes. And you keep losing, and it's used in a mixture to make dashboards in cars. So you're getting complaints from everywhere, and you're trying to be fair, and they've run out of sawdust by now. I haven't even talked about all the places it's used. Now, what's the beauty of this, I think, is to show, first of all, how deeply markets go and how easy it is to forget there's a market there. If it wasn't a market economy, no entrepreneur would be interested in, can I use sawdust? There's a lot of it around. Right now, they're throwing it away. Hey, I think I can. And gradually, all these different products are beginning to use some sawdust. And in a market economy, if there's less of it, price has to go up. And everybody, all those people using it have to think, do I really need the sawdust at that price? Maybe I don't need it. I can make a particle board with a little less. I can make the dashboard with less. So they all kind of cut back a little bit based on what they think they can get away with their customers. So economists tend to be market men, mainstream economists, almost all of them. What about distribution? What about redistribution? You know, the top 1% are getting most of the benefits of growth. What do they say about that? Well, I think economists say, first of all, almost all economists would say we should have some kind of welfare program. We should have programs that deal with poverty. And but they say, look, we have a lot of them. Food stamps are gone, but there's a new program with a different name that's essentially food stamps, and welfare is gone with a new name, but there's temporary welfare for people, and there's housing assistance, and there's earned income tax credit, and of course there's Obamacare, which helps people at the bottom most, and there's Medicaid, which is all aimed at people who don't have much money. So we have a lot of money being redistributed from the well-off down to the poorer folks, people below median income. And some economists would say, I don't think we want more because we don't want to take too much money from wealthy people. Remember, wealthy people are the people who give money to startup companies where they have good ideas, but they don't have the money. And so a lot of wealthy people, you'd be surprised, they don't spend as much on themselves as you think. They like to invest. They like to think I've started a company and they wouldn't be thriving without me. And so anyway, all these startups are going to be unhappy if we put the taxes too much on wealthy people. And so we don't want to put too much. You got to think about the effect on growth. But so I wouldn't be surprised at all if most economists think we should take more, that the rich aren't paying the share. The top 1% aren't paying the share. They're paying more than you think by reading the newspapers, mainstream newspapers, because it depends when you start counting. If you start counting from a low area in a recession, growth for everybody is more than it is if you start counting what your decades that you're looking at from a high spot. So there's lots of ways to manipulate where you start. It's not manipulation. There's no rule that says you ought to start counting here. But the point is, there's more going on than you might think, and less going on among the top 1%. But they're doing great. Don't get me wrong. And most economists, I think, would say that nothing matter, we're taking more than we get right now from the top. But if you look at the biggest in percentage terms, the biggest quintile that's done the best, it's not the top 1% over the last few decades, it's the upper middle class. People say the middle class is disappearing, but it's disappearing more because they're going up to the upper middle class than they're going down. What about mobility? Well, it turns out the mobility at the top is more than you might think. If you look at the Fortune 400 and where they got their money in the last couple of decades, far more from entrepreneurs who maybe started off with a little bit of money, but they only made the Fortune 400 because they started a company that did very well. You know, the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gateses, and so on. If you look at the top 400, you'd be surprised at how much over a couple of decades, how much turmoil there is and how much up and down there is. What went down when the entrepreneurs went up? People who inherited their money. So there's a cut in half in the Fortune 400 compared to where it was a couple of decades ago. So that's good, right? We don't want inheritance to be taking all the money. And that's why, you know, most people think rich people get away with more than they should, not only with ordinary taxes, but with estate taxes. They just don't pay what they should be paying. They find sneaky ways to get away from it, or they just don't pay it. They hide it. Nobody catches them. Okay, so there's a good bit of complaints where we are now at the margin from whether there should be more redistribution. I think there'd be pretty much agreement we should be getting more from the top, but it would be better for our economic growth if we got it by just having people pay what they're supposed to be paying. And you'd be amazed at the number of cases where people, it's decided the IRS pays this, says you should pay this much. Maybe the rich guy takes it to court. The court says, no, you should pay this much. And he doesn't pay. At every income level, this happens. There's money on the table nobody gets because nobody says, hey, did he ever pay? Every income growth, this happens with. So anyway, generally mobility is doing pretty good at the top, not so good elsewhere. It's not as great as it is in Canada. It's not as great as it is in Western Europe. If I had more time, I'd give you some tips as to how economists think we might have more mobility. And it's in my chapter. I hope you'll, if you wish I said more about equity, I hope you'll go and take a look at that. Take a look at the whole book. Towards the end of the book, my tone really shifts. I've been praising economists and saying, boy, the ordinary folks can learn a lot better and talk about politics in a more interesting, knowledgeable way. In fact, this is one of the things my students tell me after my classes. They say, you know, I read the newspaper differently than I used to because I think about economics as I read it. Well, economics is great. It's got terrific insights, but it's got terrible blindness about a lot. It's got troubling blindness. And why is that? I think it's mainly because, you know, they look at human beings in the market, and in the market, they're selfish. Let's face it. Businessmen want to make money. They like high prices. Consumers want to get products at a low price. They meet in the middle. Supply hits demand. But if economists are studying markets all the way, they tend to think people are more self-interested than they are. They're more money-oriented than they actually are. Because here's what an economist says happiness means. Happiness means lots of goods, services, and leisure. How do you get more of all those things? You have more money. So if we get economic growth, everybody will have more money. That's the best way to make people happy. Now they say this not on studies based on happiness, but just kind of ahead of game. That's their assumption. And it was easier to get away with that 35 years ago than it is now. Now there's a part of psychology called positive psychology, and a lot of people are looking at what actually makes people happy. And it turns out the most important thing, far more important than money, is connections to recreational associations, to churches, and most of all to family and friends. If you have a lot of connections, you're going to be happy. It's far more important than money for being happy. What do non-economists say about happiness? A lot of them are studying it these days, and they find out that people are motivated not just by self-interest and money, but for example, they like to do good. That charity is a part of what they like to do. They get pleasure from it. And let me give you just one example: Meals on Wheels. Now, this is the kind of program that economists don't like because it spends money on something assuming they know what the consumer wants. And they say, look, if the consumer wants a hot meal, he can get it at the grocery store. We can give him money, he can get Stouffer's, but if he wants to spend on something else, he can. What's the point of having a whole administrative apparatus for Meals on Wheels? And the Meals on Wheels people who actually in the trenches, they say you got it all wrong. The best thing we bring to our people we bring to, one of them has 18 people a week they take one meal to. Others have said, I've been doing it for 2 years. If you wonder why, if you could see that happiness I bring to these people, lots of time I'm the only person they see all week. They all want to talk, have big smiles when they see me. It's fun to be around people with big smiles when they see you. I get a lot of pleasure out of Meals on Wheels, more than I expected. That's why I do it. And most important, the most important thing I bring to these lonely people is companionship. Now, the economists don't have any sense that that's the case, any sense at all. So there's an unbalanced emphasis on self-interest. That's pretty much all I have to say. There's more, of course, I can say about what I don't like about them, but don't forget what I do like about them. And believe me, everybody of all ideologies could learn a lot by learning some economics. And I think my book, which I most help, the person I hope most reads it is someone who took economics. I hated it. All those graphs. Well, Dad told me I had to take it. I took it. That's the end of it. I want that guy to read my book because I think he'll think a different way about economics after he finishes. He might even read the newspaper differently. In any case, I appreciate the time you spent with me. Thanks very much.